आप सेट कर लें।
यहाँ से
Thank you.
What is this hum? What is the hum too close to each other? All of them should not be on. Yeah. Just put them on, put them off, and I'll speak, and then these people will be on, and then you'll speak.
Mine's off.
It's nice to know that I have one that doesn't work. It does, but there's no light. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin on time because the weather is inclement, for Pakistan at least, and I hear we're going to be in the low single digits tonight. This, of course, is a cause of happiness to many young people, and to me, people like me who are growing old, it's obviously not quite so joyful. But anyway, I want to say that this is an important occasion for Mohatta, and those of you who have decided to arrive on time will derive full benefit from some of what I'm going to say. This is not an ordinary day for us because we are, with twisted arm, in the case of Manan and Asghar, we are formally hosting Manan for a conversation. Authors like to speak about their recent books, and those of us who were fortunate enough to have attended the lecture opportunity provided by Akbar Zaidi at the city campus of the IBA would have heard Manan's superb lecture on his book, The Loss of Hindustan and the Idea of India. But we have been a little neglectful in drawing Manan here earlier, because although all books lead into books, and I would say the connection and the link between Manan's first book on the Book of Conquest, the Chachnama, and the second book, the Loss of Hindustan, it actually is a continuum of a series of ideas that he expounds in both books. It's like a microcosm being led by a larger and wider macrocosm, although he does use macrocosmic ideas in dealing with the first book as well. But there is a unity, there is a development of ideas. All this shouldn't come as a surprise, because Manan is not your average academic. He is, if I don't get it wrong, apart from being a historian of South Asia and West Asia, he is an associate professor at Columbia University. But there are some strange things he's doing at Columbia University. He's looking at intellectual history. He's looking at new ways to think outside the box in historiography and the writing of history. He's looking for new relationships and new structures in defining South Asia and the larger world around the Indian Ocean. And I think that he takes the Chachnama as his first incursion, first well-developed incursion, and the book, The Loss of Hindustan, is the second. Of course, Manan is free to speak about in his conversation with Asghar Soomro. Asghar what? Asghar Soomro, I'm right. On whatever he likes, but he will, of course, mention his second book because some of you have heard about it through the media and through friends. The book is available up here, I'm told, and is newly published in Pakistan. You won't have to pay the extortionate prices that Harvard University Press demands in Pakistan. But even if you were to pay those prices, I think you would consider this an important thing. Before I go on to the two speakers, I want to make a series of short and important announcements. The first is that Manan finally consented in a conversation with me as trustee for the Endowment Fund Trust. Hamida Khund is here to keep an eye on me so I don't transgress my powers. We are going to print the book on the Chachnama in English in Karachi. He's going to make it financially possible for us because we're not a profit trust, and we do these things to make his ideas accessible to people in Pakistan. He, of course, put one rider on it, which I spoke to Hamid Ahund about, and Hamid is absolutely agreeable to the idea. He thinks it's a fabulous idea. Manan wants the book to be translated into Sindhi as well. And since the Endowment Fund Trust of Sindh works on Sindhi, Urdu, and English books, there's absolutely no problem on that. So that is the first bit of welcome news I bring you at the Mohatta Palace. Both the Endowment Fund and Mohatta Palace collaborate very closely, and this stage is an appropriate place to bring this up. The second one is, and we already had an earlier commitment from Adila Suleiman to do the miniatures for this volume. So it'll be an absolutely rare item. It's not just a plastic copy of anything. The second thing is an even more exciting idea, and I promised Manan I'd put him at a disadvantage, which is that on behalf of the Endowment Fund Trust, I would like to invite Manan to seriously consider writing a book on the intellectual history of Sindh within the kind of concepts he speaks of, how its geography is viewed, how it changes, how it comes through a prism of nationalism, how its heterogeneous aspect with societies, both north and west of it, and perhaps even east of it and perhaps even west of it, will come into the picture. And he is free to draw up the kind of parameters that he would look at. I've discussed the matter again with Hamid Ahund, who's very excited about it, and I'm sure the Endowment Fund Trust will greet the proposal because they were the ones who moved to publish the Book of Victory, the Book of Conquest. So this particular request is something that Manan can respond immediately to. I can then introduce Asghar and then we can begin.
I mean, if I say no, we're not going to have a talk. So all of you are just going to, I can't hold you hostage, but you know, I will do everything in my power to have something like this. Absolutely.
Manan is one of the most important history writers and historians, but I hate to cover him with something as simple as historian. He's much more than a historian. He's an active historian who looks at the kinds of parameters, the kinds of perspectives. Maybe he's the other side of Herodotus, we don't know. But at any rate, I think we need to involve him. He visits Pakistan. We need to involve him in life up here. And the intellectual history of Sindh in the dimensions that he describes with the kind of perspectives he describes is something that's hugely important for us. Of course, a lot of myths and folk stories will be broken. We Sindhis have a habit of going to Mohenjo-daro to begin our story, and then we jump happily into the post-Daulpur scenario and show that we were always there, a prism for nationalism. Manan has a cure for that as well, as he explores the nationalist lens in these matters, but his whole approach is so much wider and so much more exciting. Asghar Soomro is making his first appearance at Mohatta Palace at this podium. He's worked in Sindh government very actively in health and education and has worked with international institutions who do such work in Sindh. He doesn't mention having specifically worked in history, but as an MPhil student at Jamshedpur University, he obviously felt the attraction of Manan Ahmed as much as we do. This is a healthy early crowd at Mohatta for something at 5. Normally people drift in at 5:30. So now I'm going to shift seats with Asghar and let Manan and Asghar talk about the Chachnama and his very exciting first book. I would strongly suggest you go onto the net and purchase it because it is an absolute classic. And having the Pakistani edition will make you feel happier. Having the Sindhi edition should make you collectors who collect such things even happier. But I think the first edition is always the first edition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello.
There's no light.
Manan Sahib, my first question, I think without further.
I think before starting, just introduce Manan as you see him. And
Okay.
that will give us an idea where you're coming from.
Thank you very much. First time when I heard about this book, a book of conquest, Chachnama and Muslim origins in India, I was very much interested because I heard a lot about this book. Particularly, I heard from a friend who referred me to this book that this is worth reading. So when I picked up the book, I tried to find the book in Karachi, but I couldn't find it. So I got the soft copy and then got it printed, and then I read the book. So I found the book so exciting and interesting that I finished it within 24 hours, and then I started reviewing the book, and my review was published in 2-column series in Daily Kavish, and then I also wrote for the Urdu Humsab website for the book. So it was very interesting. Why I was attracted to this book, because we have all heard and learned from our history books and historians that Chachnama is the main source of since history, and it is being used by everyone, Muslims, Hindus, colonizers, as a tool to propagate and advance their own agenda. But when I read this book, I was really startled to know that this is not the historical account, but rather an imagination of the author. It's a fiction, it is an epic poem. So I was really surprised that these are very big statements and very strong argument against the Chachnama. So this is the reason that I try to understand that what are the logics and evidences the author has provided in support of his arguments. And honestly, those arguments were very convincing, and I myself found to a great extent converted to the version of the author's re-examining of the Chachnama. So now I proceed to the Manan Sahib to further probe him that what are his own thoughts on this. Manan Sahib, my first question to you is that you have said that this is not a historical account, Chachnama. It's a imagination of the author, it's a fiction. So what evidences did you find against this, that it is not a historical account, but rather something that author has been written locally? So my first thing is,
I want to first of all thank the incredibly generous, way too generous, in fact bordering on lies introduction that I've received. I am a student of history, and I've been trying to figure out, I guess, a basic question. The astuteness of the introduction does note the fact, and for its brilliance, the brilliance of the introduction, that this is a question that I wanted to write in 3 books. The 2 of them have been published. The 3rd volume I'm writing right now, and it's all 3 books basically revolve around a question of how we make sense of our past, when our past has gone through, I guess, 2 layers of trauma: the colonial trauma and then the post-colonial trauma. And these 2 layers of trauma, I mean by word trauma, I mean both a type of alienation from this past. We don't read or study particular languages in which the past was written, but also that nationalism of all sorts have weaponized the alienation into prejudices and into differences. So the question becomes that, as a medievalist, as someone who's trained to think about, 9th, 8th, 9th century, we tend to say, well, the stuff that I work on isn't really important. It's antiquarian, it's of limited use. We sit in dusty spaces looking at unedited manuscripts. But entire political worlds have been established on the ways in which medieval history is constructed and written about in the subcontinent. Babri Masjid, I'm sure, needs no introduction to see how medieval history was weaponized and continues to be weaponized to this day. And Chachnama belongs very much to that genre of medieval texts that became instruments of alienation, of othering, and of political forgetting, which is a concept that I talk about in The Loss of Hindustan. I want to preface this question of what Chachnama is not, or what I think it is, by simply reminding everyone, you may or may not be familiar with it, by a very specific argument that is put forth in the 18th century, in the middle of the 18th century. And that argument says that Muslims, solely on the basis of their creedal affiliation, also have a dispositional or even genetic distance from the place in which they are inhabiting. Now, this argument that Muslims are outsiders is a very kind of unique argument. It's an argument that only in a reverse image is part of diasporic movements, where diaspora says we are from somewhere else. So this is a mirror image where a population says we are from somewhere else. And this argument develops within colonial historiography based on a very kind of long Oriental attachment that the ideas of Islam are embedded in geography, desert, unlike any other religion, which can be dislocated from its source of origin and become a global faith of whatever sort, right? So Christianity isn't wedded to Bethlehem. Judaism isn't wedded to Egypt. So this idea that Islam is wedded in a conceptual and ideological to the space of Arabia is a particular colonial reading of the past. Chachnama became a very important text to operationalize it. It was done by political agents working against the Talpur regime in Sindh. It was done with a very specific purpose to prove the idea of Oriental despotism. The Talpurs were imagined to be despots of basically of the apex of despotism. And the idea was that they are degenerate, deviant, they are cruel, they are uncivilized, barbaric, and that by overthrowing them, as Outram did, who was a political agent, and Eastwick and other people that I talk about in the book, that by overthrowing their despotic rule, liberal freedom could be brought to this land. How would a text written in the 13th or the 8th century, doesn't matter, how would that really play a role? And that was the kind of initial emphasis that I began with. Like, you can simply say, US went into Iraq. When I was my first year of graduate student, as a graduate student, 9/11 happened. I became Muslim under the kind of pecuniary surveillance economy of United States. And shortly thereafter, the Iraq War happened. And so I'm trying to study conquest. And I'm watching a conquest happen in real life. And I'm like, okay, how do you make a case for war? How do you say Saddam Hussein is a dictator? We have to go and overthrow him. That if we do so, it's a good thing to do. Well, if those of you remember, if you were paying attention back then, you would see there was a lot of things that were used. There was fake evidence, right? Yellow cake. There was the idea that Saddam Hussein was brutal against its own population. The Ba'athist regime worked against its own population. There were ideas that the opulence of his palaces, the numbers of his sons, the Mercedes that he had, right? So there's arguments that were built, and the ways in which he had proclaimed things, texts were used in the US case against Iraq war. And when I looked at the political agents who were writing in the 1830s into the 1840s, I see exact same thing happening. Fake evidence. Those of you who read Normal Hodgson's memoirs will a text that deserves much closer attention would be familiar with this. So fake evidence, the idea of opulence and degeneracy, and then most importantly, a textual reason. And the textual reason was a text that had to prove that the Muslims were outsiders, that their very beginning was something mired in conquest. And so Fathnameh-i-Sindh, the book of conquest of Sindh, or the opening of Sindh, Bil Maruf, Chachnama, becomes the text that is picked up by the political agents and used as a demonstration of 1,000 years long Muslim domination. Now, my argument against that reading, that colonial reading, was that actually it's not simply that it's not a translation, that it's a 13th century text instead of an 8th century text. I don't think that's enough. What I saw in my field work and the research I did was that actually it cannot be defined simply in the negative sense. It is not something that people have said or claimed that it is. In contrast, what I try to show in the book, and I firmly believe, is that it's a brilliant political theory. It's how to actually conduct a government, a state, using not capital, but lowercase s, a political rule that is inclusive again, lowercase I, in the sense that it is trying to fuse different political structures together. So you need a theoretical framework for it. And Chachnama provided such a theoretical framework. And it does this brilliantly in the structure of the text. The text is in two parts. The first part is the story of Chach, Rai Chach, hence Chachnama. The second part is the story of Muhammad bin Qasim. The first part shows Chach coming to power, the alliances he makes, the negotiations he does, where he messes up, where he doesn't mess up. The second part is a mirror image of the first part. The same type of choices that are presented to Chach are presented to Muhammad bin Qasim. Muhammad bin Qasim makes some decisions in the same way and some decisions opposite way. And the text wants you, the reader, who are imagined to be specifically people working in Nasiruddin Kabacha's court, so people who are diplomats, bureaucrats, civil servants, intellectual elite. It wants that reader to understand how these choices have to be made. What's at stake if you say a certain community should pay taxes? Or what's at stake if you say anyone who is an office holder should be a Muslim rather than a non-Muslim? Or what does it that says that I want to establish a new capital city or a new city, and here's a site that I should choose for that establishment? What's at stake in these decisions? What does it mean to make such decisions? This is a history of an actual history that is being written, if that makes sense, right? This is being written in the 13th century to say, we can actually look back to 500 years and tell you what kind of decisions were made and why we may want to make different decisions. And I'll stop with the why Chachnama as a political theory may be important in the early 13th century.
So just before you ask a question, I'd like to ask Manan. Manan, can you say something more about Nasiruddin Kabacha's court? In your book, you actually write about its intellectual linkages and administrative linkages with Delhi and other centers.
Yeah, exactly what I was going to lead to, that The world of the early 13th century is a world of incredible crisis in this space, right? The Chinggis Khan and his son Hologwe Khan are destroying a series of capital cities and learning centers throughout Central Asia, coming into Hindustan. So there is a lot of precarity. Kabacha himself is in a two-way war with two other lieutenants of the Ghurids in order to proclaim Uch, where he's based, as the real capital, the one that's situated on the Indian Ocean world, as opposed to the other two possibilities, Lahore and Delhi. Delhi is nothing on the map at this time. Lahore has something. Uch is the world's center. So Kabacha, over a 20-year period, invites intellectuals, invites jurists, invites poets. The first major histories, poetic anthologies, travel writing, juridical works are all done in Kabacha's court within 10 years. All of them in Uch, physically in Uch. Uch is, if Kabacha hadn't died and lost these battles, would have been the political and cultural center of Hindustan, of the subcontinent. So what happens is, it's this kind of confluence of a incredible political threat, incredible destruction that's happening, coupled with an effort, a decade-long effort, to cultivate a space of learning and excellence. And this is, I'm repeating language that Kabacha articulated, that we know from our letters, from Aufi's collection, from Kufi, the author of Chachnama. So this is the world in which, if someone says, I want to write a book of political theory, they would be welcomed, because we need a political theory right now. We're trying to figure out political rule. And so that's the kind of contours of why Chachnama becomes such an important book. And I'll end with this fact that Chachnama is quoted or cited, however you want to think of it, over the next, 800 years until colonial rule, almost always by people in high administrative roles. So the governor of Multan, the governor of Lahore, the governors that Akbar has sent to Sindh, people who are basically engaged in large-scale administrative work are the people who cite the Chachnama. The only time it really enters significantly historical thinking is when Farishta, which is the subject of my second book, picks up Chachnama in order to write the history of Sindh, which for Farishta, Sindh becomes a very important, again, political argument. So Farishta is the historian that brings Chachnama into historical record, into historians. And it's Farishta, when Farishta is moved and is picked up by the colonial administrators like Alexander Dow and Eliot, it's through Farishta that Chachnama enters the political agents. So that's the line actually connecting the two books, that Chachnama exists to be weaponized for the colonial state because Farishta cited it, used it heavily, and Farishta is the original text that enters Europe as a universal history. And that part of the story is in Loss of Hindustan, and what happens to Chachnama when it's picked up by the colonial state and what it really means is in a book of conquest.
So if we believe that Chachnama was written in 13th century, not in the 8th century, and its audience were Muslim rulers who were struggling to get the
Rulers, not Muslim rulers.
Okay. They were Muslim.
No,
Kabacha was
Kabacha was Muslim. But the text is not about Muslim. The text is about rule, which is why Chach is such an important figure in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I'm talking about the 18th century. 13th century, you were mentioned that So my question is that why Chachnama is totally silent about the problems that were faced in the 13th century, and it has fully focused on the issues on the 18th century. So it only talks about the invasion of Arabs in the 18th century, before that Church and all these things. So why it does not even slightly mention that what was happening at that time in 13th century?
That's a great question. So I think another way of answering this question is, okay, you're in a political turmoil, you need a political theory. Everyone is writing the greatest hits of uh, Persian poetics, Persian prosody, even travel writing. You are commissioned for a different text, but you don't get that commission. So you are a person who's going to, without a commission, write a history. So how do you get that history into the hands of the elite ruling class? What's the argument you're going to make? You're going to go to them and say, hey, I've written a political theory, and here's some do's and don'ts. It's a hard sell, very hard sell. But what will get the political elite's attention? What will get the political elite's attention is that in this world of turmoil, and please stop me if this reminds you of something else, in this world of turmoil, I'm going to return to an originary moment when it all started, and everything around us that's in chaos was in distillation at that time. So if I focus on this origin, we can explain the world that we are in. And for that purpose, let's go to the beginning of when the Muslim polity was emerging in sin. So this is a specific argument for his political theory to be taken up as a history for Kabacha. And now, part of it is in his preface, he says, I consulted, he uses the word muhakkikeen, I consulted researcher. But then there's a very curious kind of izafa. And he said, is in connection. He said, I consulted the researchers of the everyday bazaar, of the everyday merchants that are moving through Urch. In other words, there is a claim here that the story of Chach, which is a story that does not exist anywhere else, is something that connects Kufi to stories that are not coming from the elite court that he's a part of. Right? So it's how to tell a people's history of origins and how to reframe it for himself. And I think this question of origins, this question of kind of looking at the origins of Muslim polity is also happens slightly before Kufi's text in Lahore by Fakhruddin Mudabbir, who also writes the history about 10 years before this history. I don't know if the two texts ever met, but it's very clear that there is a moment in which genealogical thinking is important. It's important to say that you are descendant of Arab troops that may have come from this side or that side. It is very important to say that the Sufi that you are aligning yourself to your court is coming from that side or that side. So the question of Fakhruddin Mudabbir is someone who literally finds a genealogy for himself after they've broken down and burned Lahore. It's a very curious thing to find. Like, I've destroyed most of it, but hey, here in this Sandukji is a genealogy of me that connects me